the first one is from Carla McDuffie.
Can a person raise their hand so we get, or stand up so we can see who the person is?
Oh,
Where
okay.
are they? Oh, great.
Okay,
good. That's okay. We just like to know who the question's from. Yeah.
Okay. So Carla's question is, how do we develop and instill in others the courage to self-examine and reflect on bias, hidden and not hidden? So again, the question is, how do we develop and instill in others the courage, and courage is underlined, to self-examine and reflect on bias, hidden and not hidden?
I would say the best way that I know is by being authentic about our own and communicating it in a way that demonstrates both self-compassion and compassion. You know, one of the challenges is that most of us are used to hearing our bias exposed to ourselves by other people as an attack. You know, you are such and such. And one of the challenges we have is that we're learning from the brain research is that feeling like somebody's trying to fix you triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain, the cingulate gyrus. And so when you, and most of us who are in relationships know this, right? You know, when your partner tries to fix you, it's like, get the hell out of here, you know. Whereas when we're sharing from ourselves, when we expose ourselves and then invite people into the conversation, we create safety for them to understand that maybe they've got the same thing. Now that's not to say that when somebody, I'm not saying you just sit and watch if somebody's being harmed by that. That's a different kind of an intervention. There's sometimes when you just have to stand up and take out the sword, because I'm not going to allow this to continue to happen. You know, it's when, you know, when you're on a storm at the sea, it's not the time for the captain to call for consensus leadership. You know, there are times when you have to take action. But I'm talking about when we're in conversations with each other, that sharing your own actually creates space for people to see their own.
Okay. So this one is, can you speak about race, in air quotes? Is race a social construct invented in America to justify slavery? Is it worth discussing this or not, given our aversion to science and logic? So the question is, can we speak about race? Is race a social construct invented in America to justify slavery? Is it worth discussing this or not, given our aversion to science and logic?
You're looking at me like, uh-huh. I would say on race, that we're all part of the human race, first and foremost. Race, indeed, is a scientific construct by which we further define individuals. How it is actually then applied in society becomes the challenge, because it is indeed it has been created as a science definition, because it's a way in which we can define and describe who we are, but only a part of who we are, not the fullness of who we are. And it's how we choose as individuals and institutions to address it, deal with it, value it, or respect it, or disrespect it.
Yeah, you know, we have to understand that American culture, the socioeconomic structure of our culture was built on distinction of race. You know, it started back in the 17th century when we had landed gentry and then the working class people who were farmers or who were indentured servants or who, you know, worked places. And really from a very early stage, those people who were workers started to say, how come these folks have everything and we have nothing? And so there was a very intentional decision made on people's part in the late 1670s to say, now, if they all get together, and this was the very early stages when people of color were starting to be introduced, but if they all get together, we're going to be in trouble. But if we convince half of them that they're like us and on our team, and that the real problem is those other people who are darker, then we can break up that potential coalition that could be threatening to us. And so the institution of race in America specifically was very consciously made in a way to hold the social structure, the economic structure of a society in place. Now once that was made, of course, it was continued when the Chinese were brought over to work on the railroads, when Latinos were brought over, specifically Mexican Americans brought over to pick the crops, you know, then it continued. But this is not some accident that happened. It's something that was a historical imperative for a particular purpose, and it's still with us today, of course.
I would say one other thing on that. That race became a construct of our public conversation when we began to see different people. The Native American people were here before we came to America. And the construct of race was established prior to the, as I would say, the invasion. Now, I know that's blasphemous to some people to talk about colonization as an invasion, taking over another's land. But what is an invasion? It's when things happen against your will. We're invaded and bombarded by the media and how it chooses to portray race. We're bombarded and we're invaded by the rhetoric of either hate or love around race. We're bombarded and invaded when the imagery we see of violence being perpetrated against people is only the violence being perpetrated against a particular color, and color is not the same as race. And so sometimes when we talk about racial profiling in our society, we're not talking about race at all, we're talking about color. So the construct of race is variable on how we respond to it with the goal of responding, not reacting, and that's the brain piece. All right.
So we might say the crazy horse was the Lakota Director of Homeland Security. Yeah.
All right.
Let me just add one more piece when you said the Lakota. This morning I sent out a text to my family and said to them, give me one word when you think of culture of peace. And my sister-in-law texted me back. And Oscar, my 7-year-old nephew, his response was, when you think about a culture of peace, the best way to get there is through chi, the energy within. 7. Okay? My 9-year-old niece, Rosa, when thinking about peace, she came back with Dakota and the Dakota tribe of people that sought peace. That even when they were captured, they saw peace. And when they captured others or brought them in, they believed that it was one ground to farm. It wasn't just their land to farm, but it was to be farming for everybody. And so she went to the Native American culture when she thought about peace. So I thought that was just interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. Do you have any thoughts about the hostility brought out via the campaign? I'm guessing they're talking about the current election campaign. Is this a cyclical thing that is coming around again? Is this a poison that is being exposed in order to be expiated? Again, do you have any thoughts about the hostility brought out via the campaign? Is this a cyclical thing that is coming around again? Is this a poison that is being exposed in order to be expiated?
Well, it gets back a little bit to the things I talked about earlier. I mean, I would hope that it's cyclical, but I worry that it's really a bigger trend than that. I think one of the challenges, can I go back to the 60s when we had a lot of discord with each other, but even in the 60s around the Vietnam War and things like that, or civil rights, you had your Scoop Jackson Democrats who were pro-war and your Paul McCluskey, Mark Hatfield Republicans who were anti-war. You had your, Southern Democrats who were anti-civil rights, but you had your Northern Republicans who were pro-civil rights. And like I said before, that big middle, that big hump in the middle where we were all kind of going back and forth. And now what's happened is the combination of the fear in our culture and this bifurcation of information that we get is creating more separation around ideology than we've ever seen in our history. They study, there's some folks who study ideological segregation, and interestingly enough, the way they look at it is what they call the Cracker Barrel whole food phenomenon. It's true that if you watch people who live around whole food markets versus people who live around Cracker Barrel, you see almost a perfect breakdown of American conservatism and liberalism. And And as funny as it's true, but this is true. These people have studied it. Like if you go into the Wasserman report, you can see this research. And what it shows is that over the last 30 years, those percentages, the differences in those percentages have gone from 10% to 45%. That most of the people who live in communities with people who think like them. And we see this in Congress, of course. We see these congressional elections, which are almost all, a tremendous high number of them anyway, are sweeps every time. The Democrat wins this one by 25, the Republican wins that one by 30. And so it's one of the challenges that we have is that we're not naturally in those conversations. Now, historically, the place this was mitigated was often in the workplace, sometimes in our church groups, sometimes in schools, where we would talk with each other about this and we would debate this with each other. But now what's happened is the toxicity of our political system has gotten so much that we ain't talking about this at work. We're not talking about it in our neighborhood. I'll talk about whether or not you need paper or a cup of sugar or something like that, but we're not going to go into politics, because that could be too dangerous. And so instead of having those robust debates about things where we're sharing ideas and we're sitting with people who are neighbors and friends and talking to them, we're now like, we ain't gonna go there. Because it's challenging to do. And that's why that piece, Elizabeth's piece about taking the other to lunch, I think is so important. To really reinstate that dialogue that just because you have different philosophy from me doesn't mean you're evil.
I would just add one piece to that. I actually think that some of the rancor in the politics is a blessing, because it has allowed us to have this conversation. Part of what I believe in some of the rancor in this political dialogue is that there's a demographic shift that people can't control, that control versus support. And instead of seeking ways in which we can support the growth and the development of all communities within our nation, we want to be able to control them. Right? So the demography changes. Those who have always had privilege and preference are beginning to see the world that doesn't always look just like them, and that world that doesn't look just like them, they can't control. And so we begin to see this rancor. And so I think it's a good thing, because what has it done? It's lifted off the mask. I was raised in New England, and I always thought that people were prejudiced in the South. Right? That you only had Ku Klux Klan members in Mississippi. And then when I was 19, we had a Ku Klux Klan rally in the state of Connecticut. It was visible. It made a difference for me to understand that it didn't have to be someplace else, it was where I was living. And so part of what I believe is happening because of this rancor and the espousal of this one isn't good enough and that one doesn't belong here and I'm true and you're not and you're a liar and you're up, blah, blah. It's letting us see the ugly side of who we are, and then we get to choose. That's what elections are about. We get to choose what conversation we want to have in this country. Do we have one that we deny humanity, or do we want to have one in which we're inclusive? Do we want to have one in which we only talk about things that make me and mine happy, or do we talk about the we and the us? So it's given us a choice. It's taken off the veneer. It's let us see the real of who we are. But in also seeing the real of who we are, it allows us to see the good in who we are. Because of the number of people who were speaking up. Did anyone see, it was viral, where a little girl's mother wrote a letter about how she was afraid at nighttime and was afraid to go to school because they thought they were going to take her mother away. And several folks in the military saw this Facebook posting. And then they started sending in pictures. I'm here to protect you. I stand for this nation because I'm in the military to protect all Americans. It didn't say some, it said all. I'm here to protect you. And then they had police officers saying, I'm here to protect you. We get to choose. We get to choose. And that's what this election represents for us. It's an opportunity to choose. We're looking at another historic opportunity to choose. And I'll just be right blunt. I sit on the Ms. Foundation for Women, so you probably can figure out who I'm going to choose. I can be authentic and honest. And it's okay for you not to choose that same person. But do so as an informed individual.
Okay, How do you have a dialogue to resolve a conflict or a disagreement if the other person or party is not willing to acknowledge they have a disagreement with us? How do you have a dialogue to resolve a conflict or a disagreement if the other person or party is not willing to acknowledge they have a disagreement with us?
Sometimes you can't. You know, there's sometimes you have to limit people's ability to do harm. I mean, you know, it's always helpful to start listening. I mean, generally speaking, you know, we start dialogues, what we call dialogues, we start discussions with speaking rather than listening. And so we begin with trying to convince, and then we're surprised when people are contracted on the other side. And often if we just start by asking people, you know, what do they see, then we get some more stuff out in the service to work with. But there are times when you meet people who are so locked into their point of view. And by the way, it's on both sides. You know, we could see this, you know, I was just talking to somebody on the way down here on the phone about this. You know, when Director Comey came out with a statement about the emails the other day, it was fascinating to watch how these two dramatically, you know, juxtaposed positions. One position was, oh, Comey must be on the take. It's a fix. Execute Hillary Clinton, or something like that. But then there was the other one, which is, oh, now she's completely innocent, pure as the driven snow, and you see this was all a lot of nonsense, you know. Very little of, you know, really thoughtful looking at, yeah, there's some stuff that happened here that maybe wasn't completely kosher, but in the net, I just, you know, that sort of thing. It was interesting to see how we could trigger. Same thing remember when Skip Gates, when Dr. Henry Gates had the beer summit incident, where, you know, Dr. Gates, one of our nation's leading historians, comes home from Asia on a trip. He goes to his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, can't get in the door, so he breaks a window to let himself in the door. The neighbors call the police, 3 policemen show up, 3 white policemen, something happens. You know, the next day, we wake up with one of our nation's greatest historians' mugshot on the TV news. And how many of us by noon that day already knew what happened there, right? We hadn't gotten any information, we didn't have any facts, but we knew what happened there. You know, one more time, ... or the other thing, well, there were two one more times. One more time when an African-American man is hassled by white police officers. But then there were people who, one more time when police officers just doing their jobs are committed or accused of racism because, you know, we don't even get the information yet. But we know. And this is where we have to guard against ourselves. We have to be careful to put more question marks where we have exclamation points.
In forming allied partnerships, do you feel that most people are better attuned to hearing the message from people of their own race? In forming allied partnerships, do you feel that most people are better attuned to hearing the message from people of their own race?
Is the question, can I hear better from somebody who looks like me? Isn't it individual? Isn't it an individual phenomena? Who do you hear best from? Somebody you trust. And what's trust? What are the elements that you need to have trust? You feel comfortable, you feel confident. When I headed the Presidential Glass Ceiling Commission, the Civil Rights Act of 1991 established a 21-member bipartisan commission to look at the barriers that impede the advancement of women and racial and ethnic minorities in this country. And the number one barrier we found was what we would call a societal barrier. And within that category was stereotyping. And it translated into people feel most comfortable with people who look like them. So when we saw in the hiring process, people hiring people who look like them, that was some of that comfort, that's some of the bias, the fear of difference. The barriers and that we put up around ourselves, the walls that we construct to learning, to hearing, to seeing, when we don't ask questions. But I would still say it's an individual phenomena. Because some people can hear well from people who look like them. Some people can hear well from anybody because they're listening. I love racism changes right here. He's just But But that's the way in which we communicate. And let me say I appreciate it because it makes me feel like I'm saying something that might be helpful. Thank you. And that's the feedback. That's feedback that we want to be able to have, an honest exchange of that. To be without judgment, to open and to listen, not only with our ears, but with our heart. How does it feel? The smell of the place. Can I assume good intent when you say something about me that might be negative? That's some of the trust. When I trust you, I'm going to assume good intent. If I don't trust you, I'm going to be suspicious. And suspicion, I also do work with Franklin Covey. The speed of trust, you know that one? And the 7 habits of highly effective, all of those good things that we're supposed to be working on every day, that we read about and hopefully we then get to practice. When we talk about trust, we talk about the counterfeit to trust. The opposite of trust is what? Suspicion. And there can be and many things that can trigger suspicion. Trust is something we get to work on. I actually believe it starts with unconditional positive regard. I value you for the humanity you bring to bear. I am not here in judgment of you. Yeah.
Okay, these are probably going to be the last two before the end. Okay, so this is actually 2 questions on one card. How can we reprogram our minds against the bad, in all caps, kind of bias? What are some practical things we can do? Again, how can we reprogram our minds against the bad kind of bias? What are some practical things we can do to help change society?
In terms of the first part of the question, there are a number of things we could do. One thing, as I said before, it starts, first of all, when we own that we have it. When we don't resist the notion that we have it, that we don't think that we're above it, but we actually get that the question we should be asking ourselves in every human interaction is not, do I have bias here, but what is my bias here? And that requires us to be gentler with ourselves, to be more compassionate with ourselves, to realize that those thoughts that pop out of your mind are like burps. You don't necessarily choose them, but we're wired through our experience to have them. It's like E4 gets pressed on the My Personal Jukebox, and that thought comes up. Mm-hmm. So when Catherine and I meet, that blue shirt goes, E4, uh-oh, I'm in danger, shows up. Now, if we really get that, that's transformative. Because instead of starting to judge ourselves and make ourselves into bad people, getting guilty and all that stuff, and doing the same to others, we all right, well, this person's mind has been trained to. This is the thing that I learned from studying Buddhism that changed, because I grew up in a time when we used to do diversity work. Some of you have been around long enough with a 2x4. Remember, you used to beat the hell out of people who looked like this until somebody saw the error of their ways and they had a cathartic moment and cried, and everybody thought this was great, you know. But what I started to notice was when I saw these people a month later, they'd always say, well, that was okay, but don't ever make me do it again. It was a recipe for getting people to walk on eggshells and not to say dumb stuff, but it wasn't a recipe for inclusion. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, one of the most, there's some researchers at the University of Virginia who actually studied this. They went all the way around the world and studied bias reduction techniques. And the single number one that they found had the biggest impact was regular exposure to exemplars from the group that you have bias against. So when you take the IAT, for example, if the IAT says you show a stronger positive association with whites rather than blacks, and that's true for about 74% of whites who take the test, and a majority of blacks as well, by the way, because you've taken in the same stereotypes as we have, then you start putting pictures in your office of famous people, not just during Black History Month, by the way. You know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with Black History Month. But it would be a lot more effective if the other 11 months weren't White History Month, you know? But to put pictures up that represent extraordinary people, and the brain starts to take that in by osmosis. And it's actually been found to be one of the most effective ways. And then in terms of seeing where it applies, like I said before, to practice that pause, you know, to step on that clutch. Okay, I notice I have an inclination here. Is it appropriate to the circumstance? I had a young man come in to my office to interview for an administrative position a few years ago, and he was, and I looked at his resume, and just to give you a little background, I've been a professional musician for most of my life. Up until about 5 years ago, I sang lead in rock and roll bands for about 25 years. So I look at his resume, and it says Berklee School of Music for 2 years. I was hooked. What do you play? What kind of music do you like? Are you in a band now? You know, But then I caught myself, and I stepped on the clutch. And I said, you know what? Let's talk about that after the interview. It was almost like consciously took that out of my mind to put it over here. I wasn't interviewing a bass player, I was interviewing an administrative person. And we can do that. If you notice, one way to do this, when I work with educators a lot, what I'll do is I'll teach them to, first day the kids are in the class, have them do a little writing assignment, and go around the room, and just on a little piece of paper, make a note of what your first impression of this child is. That's a good window into what biases might show up when you're dealing with them. It's not 100%, none of this is 100%, but there are ways that we can work on this. Yeah, I'd love to have, if I could have five more minutes just to share something to bring this to completion, you mind? So good. First of all, can we acknowledge Rene? Isn't she fabulous? We've never worked together before. What an incredible pleasure. What I wanted to, I wanted to just leave you with is, I'm a history major. That was my field of study when I was going to college, and so I've always loved history. And I think it's important, given what we're dealing with now, that we have some sense of context for what we're dealing with, because this time, I think more than any time in my life, what I'm struck with is the deep resignation that people have. Yes. That we're here again. Here we are again. So I thought it'd be worthwhile to put our work now in the context of history. Going back first to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American existentialist philosopher who lost his wife in the 1860s and in his grief went to Europe to travel, was exposed to the Bhagavad Gita, which changed his way fundamentally of looking at life. He came back and taught that to his student, Henry David Thoreau, who of course we know wrote his extraordinary tract on civil disobedience when he was in jail for refusing to pay poll taxes because African Americans had to pay the taxes and were not allowed to vote. And Thoreau, by the way, the piece that we all know as Civil Disobedience didn't have that title. It was given that title later. It was actually called Resistance to Civil Authority. Thoreau was actually an associate of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. And he and Douglass used to speak together at times. And Douglass was impacted by two men, Thomas Clarkson and Josiah Wedgwood, who were members of the British Abolitionist Society. The first time in human history that we know of that any people formed a movement for the liberation of somebody other than themselves. He went to Europe and spent time in England with the two of them. Of course, Thoreau influenced Mahatma Gandhi. When Gandhi was a lawyer in South Africa and somebody from the Indian Times newspaper gave him a copy of Thoreau's essay, turned him, of course, into a practitioner of civil disobedience, and later influenced Rosa Parks. And one of the great lies of American history, as most people here know, I'm sure, is that Rosa Parks just one day got tired and didn't want to move to the end of the bus. That's the biggest bunch of BS ever. Rosa Parks was the fourth person who the NAACP organized to protest. The most famous one, of course, but nonetheless the fourth person. And she didn't do this by herself. She was supported by two people, Clifford and Virginia Durr, who she had worked for as a seamstress. Clifford Durr became her lawyer. Virginia Durr was a close friend of Mary McLeod Bethune, the great educator, and also Eleanor Roosevelt. Both she and Bethune were on Eleanor Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet. Mary McLeod Bethune was deeply influenced by W.E. Du Bois, the great educator, the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard University, and later the founder of the NAACP, of course, who had been influenced by Frederick Douglass. She was also influenced by the suffragettes, the great movement for the equality for women, who, of course, were led by Susan B. Anthony, who actually was also influenced by Mary Wollstonecraft and was an associate of Ralph Waldo Emerson's. So these connections are here in us. By the way, Mary McLeod Bethune, by the way, also mentored, of course, the great Dr. Dorothy Height, who many people didn't even know about until shortly before her death, even though most people who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement knew her as the connective tissue of the civil rights movement. But the reason they didn't know about her was because even though the civil rights movement was our history, probably American history's greatest movement for the liberation of people of color, of African Americans, it was sexist. That women in the civil rights movement, again, a reminder that just because we got one thing handled doesn't mean we can't work on something else, right? Rosa Parks was trained by a guy named Miles Horton, who had a freedom school in the hills of Tennessee, where some of the great civil rights leaders were trained, including Stokely Carmichael, Fannie Lou Hamer, who famously said at the 1964 convention, "We're sick and tired, and we're sick and tired of being sick and tired," right? Rosa Parks was also supported by Joanne Robinson, who was a secretary for the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, and she and another woman named Juliette Morgan were among the committee that chose a young pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King to head that movement. Now, Juliette Morgan is one of the great unknown heroes of the civil rights movement. She's the only person who lost her life as a result of the Montgomery bus boycott. She actually took her own life after she got so much derision from her white neighbors that she couldn't live with it anymore. Dr. King, another myth is that Dr. King was always nonviolent, and that wasn't true at the beginning. I mean, he wasn't a violent man, but after his house was bombed, he had people there, guards with guns, until he was exposed. Actually, I forgot. Another myth is that all of a sudden the civil rights movement started in 1954. We don't remember people like the great Vernon Johns, who was Dr. King's mentor as a preacher, who'd been doing that work down south for 25 years before Dr. King ever got there. But after Dr. King, after the bombing, and Dr. King's got all these people, he was visited by a remarkable man named Bayard Rustin, another invisible hero of the civil rights movement. Bayard was the person who came up with the idea for the March for Washington in 1963. He worked for the great A. Philip Randolph, and he had grown up in a home in which W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and Paul Robeson were all friends of his parents. The reason many people don't know about Bayard was because he was socialist and he was gay. He, as well as Dr. King and others, thought it was best that he stay in the shadows because they didn't want to diminish the civil rights movement. So all these things going on. Now, Bayard teamed with Richard Gregg, who had gone to India to study with Gandhi, and actually became a mentor to Dr. King in civil disobedience and nonviolence, along with a guy named Glenn Smiley, who was the head of an organization of preachers who were about practicing nonviolence. So flip forward for a minute. Dr. King becomes the inspiration to Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who headed up, of course, the La Raza movement. They were inspired by two men, Fred Ross and his mentor, Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky, now this is where I grew up. I cut my teeth working for La Raza. And at 19 years old, I was in a room with all four of them and Dorothy Height, and I had no idea what the hell, it's like, it was unbelievable, right? But Alinsky was inspired by the Triangle Fire case where in the 1920s, or 1914 or something, where a group of female garment workers were locked into their factory, and when their fire came, they all died because they were locked in their factory. And he, of course, his community organizing strategies became the basis for Barack Obama's presidential run. And of course, Dr. King also inspired the Stonewall movement, or the Stonewall incident. First time in American history when LGBT people, gay men specifically, stood up and said, enough. And that inspired Jean Manford, whose son Morty was at Stonewall. The police called her and said, Miss Manford, we've arrested your son, and he's a homosexual. She said, of course he is. Why are you bothering him? She later went on to start PFLAG, Parents and Friends for Lesbians and Gays. And also Harvey Milk, of course, who a lot of us know because of the Sean Penn movie, right? Harvey Milk's protege was a guy named Cleve Jones, who created the Quilt Project, one of the leaders today in LGBT rights. And of course, Shirley Chisholm was also influenced by Dr. King and by Dorothy Height. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman to run for president in 1972. All of these people. And 1,000 more. 5,000 more. And in the center is you and I. See, we're not doing this by ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of greatness. And those times when it feels like that hill is too hard to climb, it's so important for us to remember that we're standing on the shoulders of greatness. And for some of us, it's our mom and our dad and our grandma and the preacher of our church or the rabbi of our synagogue or the imam. That we're not here by ourselves. It's in community that we're here. And the real question that we need to ask ourselves is, what legacy will we be leaving? This is the legacy they left for us. What legacy will we be leaving? And I know it's hard. You ever get out and do these? A lot of times I feel like I could have chosen an easier profession. Really. No. But the one thing that we have is our ability to believe that something else is possible. That's right, hope. And so I guess the last message I want to leave you with is, don't stop.